Whether you are in a Spanish 100 level class or a Spanish 200 level class or a Spanish 300 level class or a Spanish 400 level class, this whole idea of what is the natural stress or the natural emphasis or the natural pronunciation of a word, like where does the oomph go in your voice whenever you say that word, is just as important as the sounds the letters make. So this is stuff that you have learned in Spanish 1, but this is also stuff that I teach to my Spanish 300 level classes because it's so important to make sure that we are pronouncing the word correctly and not just the sounds that the letters make, but again, where does the stress go in our voice? So there are three basic rules. There are some sub rules that fit into this, but there's three basic rules that tell us how to say a word. Where do we put the emphasis in our voice whenever we're saying a certain word? So this is actually a video that I could put as the very first video of the semester. I could put it whenever we're ready to study something like object pronouns being attached to the end of affirmative commands because it comes into play. It really could be placed anywhere. It could be in a Spanish 1 class or it could be in a more advanced class. This is something that we always need to keep in mind because once again, knowing where the emphasis is in our word is just as important as the sound the letters make. Where this is going to apply most of the time in like an intermediate or a Spanish 200 level class generally is whenever we attach object pronouns to the end of affirmative commands. So pretend it's the first video you're seeing, pretend it's the 13th video you're seeing, it doesn't really matter. These are the basic rules and keep these in mind all of the time. It doesn't matter whether we are using them to show how we might have to add in an accent mark to override natural stress that occurs in a word, or a natural emphasis, or a natural oomph in a word. Doesn't matter whether we're using this to help us to figure out whether we have to add in an accent mark whenever we're attaching an object pronoun to the end of a command, or whether it's week 1 of a Spanish 1 class. Always keep this in mind, whether it be for presentations or evaluations, just speaking in general, stuff like that, because it's all about pronunciation, the natural pronunciation of words. So the three basic rules to always keep in mind, and I will provide a document to you on your course's Canvas site, are the following three rules. They're really easy. I'm just going to give you one example of each, and then we'll put them into practice in other things that we will do throughout this course. So rule number 1 says, if a word ends in an N, an S, or a vowel, the natural stress or the natural emphasis on that word when there is no written accent mark is going to fall on the next to last syllable or the next or the second to last syllable, right? So again, rule number 1 says, if a word ends in an N, an S, or a vowel, the natural stress in that word when there is no written accent mark is going to fall on the next to last syllable or the second to last syllable. That is a pretty straightforward rule, but I wanted to give you a simple little example of a word that we all know, starting with you in the Spanish 1 class, of how that rule gets put into action with the word casa. Everybody knows that the word casa means house. We don't care what it means right now. We care how it's pronounced. We don't care that the C makes a k sound. We don't care that the A makes ah sound. We don't care that the S makes sound. We're not worrying about the sounds that the letters make in terms of pronunciation. We're talking about and concerning ourselves with the natural stress or emphasis or pronunciation of a word when there is no written accent mark. So since we know that the word casa ends in an N, an S, or in this case, a vowel, let's pretend it's the first day of Spanish 1 or the first week of Spanish 1, and your instructor says to you, hey, can you read out loud? And they give you this passage to read or sentence to read or whatever. And let's say you've never seen this word before, or you don't know any of these rules, and you're trying to figure out, do I say this word, listen to like the emphasis that I put in this, do I say this word casa with more emphasis right here, casa, or do I say this word casa with more emphasis right there? Let's pretend you don't know how to pronounce that word. We could look to rule number 1, because this word is exemplary of rule number 1, since it ends in a vowel. It's a short word. We might not have to break it into syllables to figure it out, but we could, if it's a short word, or if we're just learning, or if it's a longer word, and we could say, okay, we'll roughly split this word up into syllables, and we know that since it ends in a vowel and falls under rule number 1, that the natural stress in that word is going to fall on the next to last syllable, counting from the back. Some people will say, oh, but it's the first syllable of the word. We don't care how close it is to the front of the word. And we only preoccupy ourselves with how close it is to the back, because we're counting from the back of the word. So the word casa is pronounced casa and not casa, because of rule number 1, since it ends in an N, an S, or again, in this case, a vowel, the natural stress will be on the next to last syllable. And that is the reason for which we pronounce that word casa and not casa. Rule number 2 says, and I've abbreviated here just for space sake, but rule number 2 says, any word that ends in any other consonant other than NRS. So if a word ends in any other consonant other than the N or S, the natural stress or emphasis or oomph or pronunciation of that word, the oomph is going to naturally fall when there is no written accent mark on the last syllable of that word. Again, if a word ends in any other consonant other than the N or S, the natural stress or emphasis in that word, when there's no written accent mark, is going to fall on the last syllable of that word. So again, another easy word that people learn in the Spanish 1 class, next, paper. So when we look at the word paper, or in Spanish, papel, let's pretend, again, we've never seen this word before. We don't know what it means. We're asked to read it out loud by our Spanish 1 instructor. And we know the sound the P makes, and we know the sound the L makes, and whatever, but we're not quite sure where to put the emphasis in our voice whenever we say that word. So what could we do? Following rule number 2, we know that the stress must naturally fall on the last syllable of the word, because the word papel ends in a consonant other than N or S. So we don't really need to, but if we wanted to split this word up into syllables, and we say, okay, this word happens to be exemplary of rule number 2 because it isn't a consonant other than N or S, and we know that the natural stress, because this word does not have any written accent mark on it, is going to be on the last syllable. That's how we know whenever we're asked to read out loud and we have no idea where the oomph goes in our voice, that's how we know that this word is pronounced papel, with more emphasis on the last part of the word, last syllable of the word, because of rule number 2. If we mispronounced it, and we didn't happen to follow rule number 2, we might pronounce that word, oh God, this is hard, pape, and pape is not a word in Spanish. Notice when I'm mispronouncing it, I'm putting more emphasis here, pape, and that word just simply doesn't exist. Following rule number 2, our word will have to have its natural emphasis on the last syllable of the word, and so it will be pronounced how? Papel, papel. Some students say, well, does it really matter that much? I mean, like, whether I say casa or casa, or whether I say papel or papel, does it really matter? Yes, because we have to remember that something curious happens in Spanish that doesn't often happen in English. So, like, for example, let's say I am not a fluent English speaker and I say, hey, for class today, I did 2 hours of preparation. Well, we know that I'm trying to say the word preparation. Preparation is the natural stress of that word in English, preparation. But if I messed it up, I put the oomph behind the wrong syllable and I said preparation or something like that, everyone would still understand that word. Because most of the time, if we were to happen to put the stress behind the wrong syllable in English, it doesn't change the meaning of the word. On the other hand, in Spanish, it oftentimes does. So it is so very important to make sure not only that we know what sounds the letters make, but also these basic rules, basically rule 1 and 2, because we'll see what happens with 3 in a second. It's so very important to know that if we have no written accent mark in the word, we need to think back to rule number 1 and rule number 2 to know where the oomph goes in our voice, because I'm so serious about this. There are so many words in Spanish that if we put the stress in our voice in one syllable, it means one thing. And if we put the stress in our voice on another syllable, it means something completely different. So it is very, very, very important that we keep this top of mind all the time, no matter what grammar point, no matter what vocabulary thing you might be looking at. Please keep these 2 very simple rules in mind. And then there's a rule number 3, but really I just put rule number 3 is all about accent marks. And basically, the function of an accent mark in Spanish is twofold. So sometimes an accent mark in Spanish will simply just change the meaning of the word. So for example, those 2 words exist in Spanish, sí and sí. Both of those words are pronounced the same. It's not like just because it says an accent mark and we know that we oomph or emphasize or put more stress behind our voice when we see an accent mark. It's not like all of a sudden this word is pronounced C and then this one is pronounced C softer. They're pronounced exactly the same. So the first function of an accent mark in Spanish is simply to change the meaning of the word. In this case, C with no accent mark means if, and C with an accent mark means yes. So that would be the first function of an accent mark in Spanish. The second function of an accent mark in Spanish is to change the pronunciation, which is what we're talking about right now. So I have given you this word up here, which means telephone or phone, right? And we're going to see how accent marks, whenever they change the pronunciation of words, override the natural rules 1 and 2. Because remember, the rules 1 and 2 are all about what does a word sound like? Where is the emphasis in the word naturally when there is no written accent mark? So we say that rule number 3 is all about accent marks and how accent marks override rules 1 and 2. And let's see how that happens with the example sentence word that I've given you, teléfono. So we're going to look at this word. We're going to first remember that whenever we see a word in Spanish and it's got an accent mark, we're automatically going to know that we need to put more oomph or emphasis or stress in our voice where we see that accent mark. So that's the first simple thing to remember. But let's talk about how accent marks override rules 1 and 2. So pretend for a second that this word, teléfono, with this accent mark over the second E, teléfono, let's pretend it didn't have an accent mark. Let's pretend we misspelled it. We forgot to write the accent mark in. How would it sound naturally if it didn't require an accent mark in Spanish? So we would say to ourselves, remember, we're pretending it doesn't have an accent mark right now. We would say to ourselves, okay, this word, teléfono, does it fall under rule number 1 or does it fall under rule number 2? Remember, we're pretending it doesn't have an accent mark because it always has to, right? But we would say, does it fall under rule number 1 or does it fall under rule number 2? Well, it can't fall under rule number 2 because rule number 2 is all about the natural pronunciation, stress, emphasis of a word when the word ends in a consonant other than N or S. Well, this word does not end in a consonant other than N or S. So it must naturally, if it didn't have an accent mark, it must naturally fall under rule number 1, if it didn't have an accent mark. So rule number 1, if we were just following rule number 1, we saw this word written with no accent mark, is spelled incorrectly when it doesn't have an accent mark, but we're presenting to see how that accent mark will override rule number 1. First of all, why does it fall under rule number 1 if it doesn't have an accent mark? Because rule number 1 says if a word ends in an N, an S, or a vowel, the natural stress on that word when there's no written accent mark would be on the next to last syllable. So let's break it up roughly into syllables, and we will do teléfono. So if this word didn't have an accent mark, it would fall under rule number 1, and the natural stress would be on the next to last syllable. So this is the last syllable, and this right here is the next to last syllable. The syllable F-O, or fo, is the next to last syllable. So if we happen to write this word with no written accent mark, it would be mispronounced, and it would be pronounced with more emphasis here, following the natural stress or emphasis rules and guidelines, and it would be pronounced teléfono, teléfono. Teléfono is not the word telephone or phone in Spanish. So, not you, not me, the crazy people who invented the Spanish language decided that they didn't want the noun el teléfono, or the telephone or the phone, to be pronounced with the oomph or the stress or the emphasis right here, and so they decided that they wanted it spelled with an accent mark so that we would oomph it in a different syllable. So they decided that it was going to have an accent mark right there over the E. And so by throwing in an accent mark, again, you didn't decide it, I didn't decide it, people who invented Spanish decided it. They decided that they didn't want that word to fall naturally under the pronunciation of rule number 1. They wanted to override that natural pronunciation, and that is why we pronounce this word with the accent mark, teléfono. Hopefully with that, you guys can see that it would have naturally, if it weren't to have an accent mark, it would fall under rule number 1. The natural stress would be teléfono, but those people who invented Spanish decided they wanted us to pronounce it in a different way, with stress in a different syllable. They decided they wanted us to spell it with an accent mark right here, and so the proper pronunciation with that accent mark overriding rule number 1 is teléfono. That is just one quick example of how accent marks override the natural stress of rule number 1, rule number 2, whatever. Another one could be, for example, this versus this. Let's pretend you see the word la papa and then you see el papá. Doesn't matter that I have the L or the la, so our definite articles in there. We can just focus on the word papa versus papa. Hopefully you can hear that I'm saying that in a different way. Papa versus papa. We can see that the first word here obviously falls naturally under one of the rules, either rule 1 or rule 2, because why? There is no written accent mark, and that's what our rules are about. The natural stress or emphasis or oomph of a word pronunciation when there is no written accent mark. So let's talk about that just really quickly, and then that'll be the end of this kind of natural stress, pronunciation, emphasis thing that I wanted to share with you because it can help us in so many different things, whether again it's vocabulary or whether it's figuring out if we're seeing accent marks or whatever. So this word right here, you hear me pronouncing it papa, papa. But why? It's because it naturally falls under rule number 1. Why does it naturally fall under rule number 1? Well, the reason for which it falls under rule number 1 is because rule number 1 said if a word ends in an N, an S, or a vowel, then the natural stress when we have no written accent mark is going to fall on the next to last syllable. So this word doesn't have a written accent mark. It's not spelled that way in Spanish with any accent mark. And so if we broke it down into syllables, we would have pa, pa as our 2 syllables. And following rule number 1, this is the last syllable, but this is the next to last syllable. And that is the reason for which, going under the natural rules of rule number 1, that's the reason we say that word pa, pa. So la pa, pa, with more emphasis on that second to last syllable, the potato. But then those people who invented Spanish, they decided they wanted to make another word that was spelled similarly, but with an accent mark. And a papa, the dad, we can see that that accent mark overrides the natural rule number 1, because when that word P-A-P-A was spelled with no written accent mark, it fell naturally under rule number 1, and the accent or the stress or the emphasis in our voice happened to fall because of rule number 1 on the next to last syllable, pa, pa. But they decided they wanted to say dad or the dad like this, and they said, all right, we're gonna leave it spelled with the letters the same way, but we're gonna throw in an accent mark right there. And so that will tell everyone who's learning Spanish or everyone who's reading Spanish or even little bitty kids who are fluent Spanish speakers how to pronounce that word. And it's going to be pronounced with more emphasis where you see the accent mark. And you can see that the accent mark's function in this word is overriding the natural rule number 1 that occurred in that word when there was no written accent mark. And that is the reason for which we pronounce this word pa, pa. Notice that this is pa, pa, and this word is pa, pa, with more emphasis on what happens to be the last syllable, but more importantly, just the syllable that has the accent mark on it. So the thing that I want you to take away from this video is that we always need to remember rule number 1, we always need to remember rule number 2, and we need to remember that rule number 3 is all about how accent marks serve 2 functions in Spanish. They can serve the simple function of just changing the meaning of a word, or in these examples, accent marks can serve the function of overriding the natural rules of stress or pronunciation or oomph or emphasis in the word. So what do accent marks do a lot of time in Spanish? Override the natural rules 1 and 2 and tell us, no, do not stress it naturally how it would be stressed or emphasized or pronounced based on rule number 1 or rule number 2. Rather, we want you to put the emphasis on in your voice when you say that word, wherever you see the accent mark. So that is, like I said, it could be the first video you watch. It could be something you learn in Spanish 1. It could be something that you review in a Spanish 200, 300, 400 level class, because it's always stuff that is useful to know in every single thing that you do in Spanish. Again, whether it's writing or whether it's learning a new vocabulary word or something like that. Remember, if you see an accent mark, don't forget to write it in, or if you're memorizing it or whatever, remember to memorize it with the accent mark, because changing a word from a word without an accent mark to a word with an accent mark not only changed the pronunciation, but it also changed the meaning. So people often say to me, oh my gosh, are accent marks really that important? They don't seem like they're that big of a deal. Absolutely, they are a big deal. They are considered to be part of the spelling of a word. So as weird as it may sound, or as, I don't know, insignificant as it may sound, if you forget to put an accent mark in a word, you're not only changing the pronunciation, you're not only changing the meaning but you're technically misspelling the word. So when I say as kind of dumb as it might sound, literally by forgetting an accent mark in a word, you might as well have just misspelled it. Like just said, okay, I'm just gonna spell this with a completely different letter, because absolutely, by the way, it's not a word, but we're just pretending that so that you guys can see the gravity of, like, the importance of accent marks. When you forget an accent mark, you might as well just throw in an S instead of a P, or completely misspell a word. So that is all about the natural stress, emphasis on pronunciation of words in Spanish when there's no written accent mark, and the function of accent marks in Spanish and the importance of them.